that has been on the basis of the of the of the session, and provide us the colleague the links to you and to other colleagues. Thanks to be with us. Welcome to the conference. Have a good job. To work a lot, just at 1 hour now, but you have to make a hard job. Okay. And the speaker are welcome as you are welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pasquale, would you like to lead off, or would you like me to start?
Yes, why don't you start to give a broad introduction to the session, maybe also to the School of Finance and Management, which play such a big role in our session. And then maybe I could talk a little bit about the links between SOAS and the School of Finance and Management and Tor Vergata.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone. And a warm welcome from the School of Finance and Management at SOAS, University of London. You know, we'll be hearing more from Professor Scaramozzino in a minute, but we've had a long and fruitful relationship with University of Rome Tor Vergata, and it's a link and a relationship which continues and strengthens with, for example, visiting scholars. Pasquale asked me to say a few things about SOAS and about the School of Finance and Management, and also to sort of chair the session. So I'll kind of take those two things in that order. So I'll start off by just saying a bit about the links, and then I'll say a little bit about how the session is going to operate. I think I can safely say I've never worked anywhere like SOAS, not least because there really isn't anywhere like SOAS. For those of you that don't know, SOAS is a university devoted to understanding the critical questions that affect our planet. But you know, many universities do this, but what's unique about SOAS is the kind of global perspective and this idea of understanding these questions from the perspective of different regions. So from Africa, from Asia, and from the Middle East. And I think this is very clear in the topics that are being researched at the School of Finance and Management. I mean, broadly speaking, we've got three areas. We've got finance and accounting, we've got international management, and we've got public policy. But like all these classifications, it masks the richness of the research program, which looks at a whole range of topics such as inclusive finance, artificial intelligence in finance, utility regulation, accounting practices, emerging market multinationals, tourism, sustainable, you know, there's a huge list of things. And in a way that positions us, I think, ideally for this conference, with the title of Staying Together in a New Policy Space. The only way to stay together is to have relationships that help one another and help all of us to prosper. And although the UK is not necessarily doing the best job of this at the moment, the School of Finance and Management and SOAS hopefully is doing a good job. And I think that's reflected in the talks and in this session, which look to provide insights for everyone, wherever they're from, in this new policy space. So I'm not going to say much more. We've got a very interesting session with topics such as patents, public health, economics, energy, topics that affect us all. So just to give a little overview there and say how delighted we are as the School of Finance and Management to be here. Just to give you an idea of the format, the speakers are going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we're going to have about 3 to 5 minutes of questions. So each speaker really gets a kind of bubble of 50 minutes. I'm going to be reasonably strict with the time, just because otherwise we won't get a chance to hear from everyone. So that's the kind of format. With that, I reiterate my welcome, and I'll hand over to Professor Scaramozzino, who'll talk in greater depth and doubtless with greater eloquence about the relationship between School of Finance and Management, SOAS, and University of Rome Tor Vergata. So Pasquale, over to you.
And thank you very much, Ben, for your introduction and for explaining so clearly and so forcefully what the School of Finance and Management does and what we stand for. When Professor Paganetto asked me to organize a session on COVID from the point of view of developing from a global perspective, let's say, honored. And I thought that SOAS is really uniquely placed to give a broad global perspective on the impact and consequences of the pandemic, given its regional expertise on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It also gives me great pleasure to briefly mention revisit the long-standing collaboration between SOAS and the School of Finance and Management and Tor Vergata. Now, this collaboration started in the mid-1990s already, and instrumental were Professor Luigi Paganetto, who was the founding dean of the Faculty of Economics in Tor Vergata, but also the director of the PhD in Economics, and also Lawrence Harris, the founding head of the School of Finance and Management. Laura spent a whole sabbatical year in Tor Vergata, and he got to know everybody in the faculty. Instrumental to this link was also the work by Giancarlo Marini, a close friend of ours who sadly passed away a few years ago. Giancarlo was the head of the Department of Economics in Tor Vergata, but also director of the PhD in International Economics. And he was also external examiner on our MSc program at SOAS. So he spanned both institutions. And thanks to Luigi Paganetto, Giancarlo, at SOAS, we hosted a large number of PhD students when the PhD program in Tor Vergata came to SOAS to do part of their research. And many of them stayed on in the UK. Some of them stayed on at SOAS. I remember Fabrizio Adriani, who taught at SOAS for a few years and then moved to Bristol and is now in Leicester, but also Maurizio Fiaschetti, who came to SOAS from Tor Vergata and went to Oxford, now at UCL. Francesco Solustri also came at SOAS, and he also went first to Oxford and then UCL. But there are very, very many PhD students who came to SOAS and enriched the intellectual environment of our PhD program, contributed to seminars and PhD workshops. Also, many colleagues from the Tor Vergata faculty taught in Tor Vergata. I remember Alberto Iozzi, Alessandro Piergallini, Barbara Nicchiarico. And we had a number of visitors from Tor Vergata to SOAS, Leonardo Becchetti, Furio Rossati. On the other side, well, not many PhD students from SOAS went to Rome, but I think British PhD students are somewhat reluctant to move to Europe or leave their home institution. But all of the heads of the School of Finance and Management came to Rome or spent some time as visitors. Lawrence Harris, but also Lai Jiansun, Christine Auton, and Victor Murind. And I'm very glad that Ben, you're going to continue this long tradition. Very briefly, this collaboration enabled us to undertake a number of research projects and write academic papers and long list of publication in a very broad range of areas. I just remind, we did some joint work on public finance, environmental economics, development economics, international trade. I can see Bassam, also the economics of oil, industrial organization, and comparative economic systems. So this collaboration gave rise to very many scientific pieces of research and projects. More recently, some areas of joint interests are corporate social responsibility and also the application of complex methods or methods from the analysis of complexity originally developed in physics to economics and finance. So to summarize the collaboration between Tor Vergata, the Faculty of Economics, and the School of Finance and Management has extended over more than a couple of decades. It has given rise to very many fruitful collaborations and advanced research and published in top journals. And my hope is that we'll continue to work together and exploit the synergies of the two institutions, which I think complement each other quite well. So again, I'd like to thank Professor Paganetto and Professor Harris, who were very instrumental in fostering and promoting this collaboration, and everybody else in this session who agreed to present their research on COVID and the current pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to return the floor to Professor Hardy for the scientific papers of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pasquale. And what a lovely summary of the links between our institutions. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to say very much. I want to hand over the floor to a number of colleagues, Professor Christine Outen, Joanna Bustamante, Vanessa Pesquisela, and Damien Tobin. They're going to talk about resolving the patents paradox in the age of COVID-19 and climate change. So I'll say no more and hand over. Christine, I believe you're leading off on this one, so the floor is yours.
It's actually going to be a joint presentation by Damien and myself, and Damien's going to start, but I'll share my screen and the slides and then hand over to Damien. But I'd just like to thank Professor Paganetto and Pasquale Scaramozzino for organizing this session, and it's a great honor to be part of it, so thank you. So over to Damien.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Pasquale. And thanks. Good to see you all again. So I'll start by going through the structure of what we're looking at today. So the title is Resolving the Patents Paradox in the Age of COVID. So we're going to start by re-looking at the patents debate and searching for consensus in that debate. And the principal point I think we're going to make is that really when you look at the literature in this area, there is a lack of consensus. Secondly, we're going to look at patents in the case of common pool resources and highlight some of the contradictions there in terms of vaccine rollout and climate change. We're going to look at some ways through simple games of resolving the contradictions and adapting patent law. And finally, some alternative policy instruments. The key point being that patents are not the only way of stimulating invention. So our first slide, we just decided we'd highlight two, and there's quite a lot of literature on this, but we decided we'd highlight two quotes as being quite useful in illustrating this problem. The first one's from Joan Robinson, Accumulation of Capital in 1956, and where she points out that essentially a patent is a device that prevents diffusion, and as such, there's no such thing as an ideal patent system. Okay, and the second is from Macklop and Penrose, and they essentially argue that to say that patents are effective incentives of economic activity is one thing, but it's quite another thing to contend that they are necessary for inducing a certain amount of such activity. Indeed, Macklop, in his testimony to the US Congress in 1958, argued that essentially, if you were to start somewhere, patents wouldn't be where you'd start in terms of building an innovative system. So these authors were quite critical on the issue of patents. In terms of this tension between invention and innovation, I suppose that the patent emerged as a way of resolving these, but in one sense, it was a rather blunt instrument. And a review of the debates around this would suggest that whereas there was resolution on the political front, so the political system largely came out in favor of patents, there was a lot of disagreement on the economic side, and that the result was not necessarily clear-cut. So the obvious rationale for a patent system was the relative scarcity of invention versus innovation. It was also justified on the basis that, I suppose, codifying inventions provides a better way of diffusing these inventions. So having a system of codification is more transparent. However, one of the big issues in the literature is the way it overlooks the social objectives of our society's objectives, particularly if society wants to promote innovation. So the essential loss, or where I suppose patents jeopardize the system of innovation, is this sort of temporary prevention of the use of the most efficient methods of production by all producers. I suppose since then, patents have become more complex. We can see them extended to areas such as international trade. I think seed production is a very interesting one for developing economies, and some of the literature and studies on that, particularly the work by Campi and Nuvolari, suggests that in a sense, patents have different effects on developed versus developing economies. And in a sense, there's very little correlation there between IP protection and value added, particularly in developing economies. This is particularly, I think, relevant to the case of vaccines, since if we look at the rollout of vaccines historically, particularly one of the interesting examples there is the polio vaccine and its adoption by Dutch and Israeli health authorities in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the key issues there was the ability of these authorities to locally adapt vaccines for the local population for the best methods of diffusion. So in a sense, in terms of the relationship between R&D and patents, we know that R&D is costly, and then returns are uncertain, and without patents, the argument is that we would have underinvestments. So the rationale is that our patents allow monopoly profits for a period, maybe 20 years, and they increase returns to research and development, enhance technological progress and living standards. But underneath this, we can see that the patent itself is predicated on this trade-off between static and dynamic efficiencies, where we tolerate high prices and restricted output in return for higher living standards in the future. So we illustrate this using a balance. Thanks, Christine, for the graphics on this. But just to show that what the patent does is it essentially tries to tip the balance in favor